Museum Foundation, and I want to welcome you all this evening. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to introduce the president of the Lebanon Museum Foundation, who has a few words for you. This is Paul Aziz.
I didn't get this big a crowd when I was mayor. This is pretty impressive. For those of you who don't know, I served as mayor from 2012 to 2021. So I served 10 years and decided it was time to kind of move on and focus on the museum, and that's what we're doing. In 2018, I asked for an ad hoc committee meeting for the City Council to create a museum in Lebanon. That was 6 years ago. And the council approved that, and we got $10,000 seed money. And so that's kind of where we're at today. We're still looking for a building, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But we've got a collection, and we've got a ton of these events that you may not have even heard of, but we have had them. First thing I want to do is recognize our board members. Kendra, who is the librarian here, she's one of our board members and has been since the beginning. Myself, Tani Morikawa is our curator, and she wasn't able to make it tonight. Linda Ziedrich, and we're the founding board members from the original. And then we have some newer ones, Jolie Root, Wayne Dykstra, and Pat Dykstra. And I think Wayne's here. Yeah, Wayne's back there. We started with programs with the Lebanon area Kalapuya natives with Tony Forepaugh. And that was really fascinating. We had the Sanyam Wagon Road with Tony. Another one, we did the Lebanon Timber Mills. We did a program on growing up in Lebanon and 3 different people from the area that talked. We have the Lebanon pharmacy history. We have the pictorial history of the Lebanon Oregon Fire District, the history of the Lebanon Police Department, Lebanon in the 1950s, history of Sodaville, Civil War medicine that we just had not too long ago. We had Dietz Peters here out at the park, out here on the corner, doing Native American storytelling and music. And then today we've got the tribal histories of the Willamette Valley with David. And next month will be the story of the famous Cottonwoods Ballroom. If you haven't heard of that, it's kind of infamous, I think, actually. It's got quite a storied past, but it's going to be interesting. David Creighton has agreed to come and talk to us for pictures and memorabilia.
Jim.
Was it? Oh, Jim, I'm sorry. Yeah, I wasn't reading that right. So it'll be here at the library, Tuesday, October 22nd. If you follow our Facebook page, Lebanon Museum, it's very simple, all one word, and our YouTube page, most of these events have been recorded and are on YouTube, and you can watch them back. So if you're interested in any particular subject, you can watch those. We've also done historic walks with the BLT, the Build Lebanon Trails, and so at Christmas time, during the holidays, we actually have a walk around town. It's a history walk, and you can watch for that. Again, that's with the BLT in our group. We did an oral history project funded by the Silence Tribe to capture stories of the 10 local people and their experiences. We recorded those and done those, and we got a grant for that. It's really, really a great project. Linda headed that project. We have a display at Sun Lane Stones. That's right downtown, right kind of next door to Hazella Bakery. That's the easy one to know. Everybody knows Hazella. Or across from City Hall over there. And we have a little display there. We have some of our display counters and some pictures and things. It's not super big, but since we don't have a building, it's a little bit of a presence. We are in desperate need. The library here holds part of our collection. We have some really, really cool things in our collection. From World War I, World War II military uniforms from people who lived in Lebanon, a saddle from, I think it was World War I, just some really cool old stuff, pictures, stories, just a lot of things that you guys would be very interested in. And we want to get that in a house. We don't have, or in a building, I should say. And we need a home for this. So we're still looking for a building. If anybody knows, obviously we can't go out and afford to buy a brand new building, and we can't really afford to buy a building. So we're looking for something cheap, or somebody that maybe wants to donate on a tax write-off or help us out. We just need to get this so that we can share this with everybody. We're so excited about it. But without the building, it's very difficult. So I'm going to ask, and this isn't church, we're not going to pass around a plate, but as you leave, if you're interested, if you could drop just $1 or $2 in there even. Just anything you can donate to us will help us It costs a couple $1,000s a year just to run the organization, the taxes, and donation fees, and all the stuff that we have to pay with the government, and our franchise fee and our website. So just a couple bucks will really help us out. So without further ado, I'll get away from the boring stuff, and I'll give you back to Linda. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Our speaker tonight is David Lewis. He's a member of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and he's a descendant of the Chinook, Molalla, Takelma, and Santiam Kalapuya. I think you all know at least that last term. The Santiam Kalapuya are the people who lived right here in the place we call Lebanon now. And some of them still do. I think we have at least one here tonight. David was formerly the cultural manager for the tribe, and in that job he planned and designed the Chachlu Museum and Cultural Center in Grand Ronde. Today he's a researcher, writer, and assistant professor of anthropology and indigenous studies at Oregon State University. He specializes in the history of the Kalapunians and other Western Oregon tribes, and he often publishes his findings for anyone to read on his website, the Quartux Journal, which you can easily find on the web. He lives with his wife and sons in Salem, or the former Chemekada. Please welcome David.
Thanks a lot. It's great to be back. I don't come here a lot to speak. I think I was last year about 10 years ago. It was interesting. It was less people. So, thanks a lot. I guess every 10 years is not bad. So yeah, definitely donate to the museum. It's good to have a museum in town. You can actually get your history together. You can get volunteers in your community to write histories of their family, of things that are happening in the area over time, and it really kind of cements the story of this place. So that'd be really great to have it here. I've actually contributed to current exhibits in Jefferson and in Brownsville, in Eugene and Salem, at various museums, and that's been something I've really liked doing because I could actually help the communities understand better, what the original history of this place was, the original Native people, and basically what happened to them in that history. And that's not always a nice story. That's not a clean story sometimes, but it is the story, what happened. And it's good to have the truth rather than not. So yeah, I'm a professor of anthropology at OSU. I came out of U of O, spent a good amount of time there in anthropology, so I guess I'm what they call a platypus now, right? So what you call it here. A little bit more about the Santiam. So I did a little bit of research on the Santiam, so if you've read my blog, there's some stuff on there about the Santiam, what happened to them, how they were moved to Grand Ronde Reservation. And actually there was, in Lebanon, there was one of the last encampments that was set up by the federal government here at the Ralston place. I guess it's a park now, but it used to be a big donation land claim. And that man Ralston, I think it was William Ralston, oversaw the tribes for about 9-10 months. And or at least one band of the Santiam, the Lewis band of Santiam, would basically stay in that area near his property. Probably down, I was thinking down by the river, because you really want to have access to water in an encampment like that. So I have a little write-up, a little essay on there. I think I wrote a little bit into my book too, because there were a good 10, 11 encampments all throughout the Willamette Valley, from north to south, for different peoples before they were moved to the reservation. So if you want to know more, you got to read the book. So I'll talk about the book a little bit here. It's a double presentation, and I'll talk about other research I'm doing, maybe a little more interesting things you haven't heard about before. So let's get started. So first off, cover of the book, you've probably seen it. So it's I actually employed a native artist a man named Greg Robinson, who's a member of the Chinook Nation. He does paintings, he does carvings and other artwork. And I like this piece. It looked like very much like a rolling valley like we would have around here, and perhaps close to what the Californians had for plank houses or longhouses. So that was important. So the contents of the book lay out like this, and for whatever reason I decided not to or didn't ask about putting numbers on the chapters. So if you say chapter 4, I don't know what you're talking about. So there's just titles. And so they kind of lay out historically. I really look at, the origins of the tribe, more like what happened to them, how they dealt with the settlers, or how they were dealt with by the settlers, the treaties, the temporary encampments, the removal to the reservation, and then what happened on the reservation itself. So a lot of previous histories of the tribes don't really deal with reservation era or reservation centric history, so I'm looking at that because really for me it's almost like genealogy. It's my family history, and so when you look at your genealogy, your family history, you want to know what happened to your people. And so what happened to our people was pretty grim on the reservation. They were not really fed well, or didn't have a lot of land, didn't have a lot of help, so it was pretty bad. And it really kind of addressed mostly the Caliquian, Molalla, and Clackamas people of the valley. I have lots of other stories about other tribes in Oregon, mostly Western Oregon, but I wanted to concentrate on the Willamette Valley for my first book, and I think it works out well. I'm bringing back kind of stories that were told in the past, maybe incompletely or irregularly, and I've fixed a lot of them, fixed the dates, and added details, including what the tribes may have thought about what was happening to them. So that's not something you hear about in a lot of histories. I'm now looking at mostly the colonization era and continued colonization of the tribe once it got to the reservation and on, so into the 20th century. Why I wrote this? Well, growing up in Oregon, you don't really hear a lot about Native people in schools, and that's the case today too. So most schools in Oregon don't teach about Native American peoples, their history or culture. It's a big problem we have, because how are we represented in the histories around here? Native people, we're not represented. So where in our society, even though we're equally Americans like everybody else, are we represented? And so a lot of kids who come to me and take classes from me in college and say, after the first class, they're like, I never learned any of this stuff in school, in high school or anything. And I said, well, maybe you need to rethink everything you know about Oregon history, because you're not being taught the truth. You're not taught really what happened. You're only being taught one side of the story. You need to be taught the whole story, the other side of the story too. So I'm trying to address that need. This book then can become curriculum in schools, in college, in high school, and for the regular public, the community, to learn more about the history of this area, about the tribes, and sort of fill in that gap that we have, that those what we call silences in our community, where nobody really knows what happened to tribes, and most people seem to deal with tribes in kind of a stereotypical way. And so let's deal with that issue by, getting you some accurate history of what happened to peoples here. I lived here for a very long time, 10,000 years or more. So I try to explain these in the book, and also when I brought the text to the press, they were saying, well, this is interesting, but it's kind of dry and boring, so let's add more to it. And they wanted me to write personal accounts in there of my encountering these histories personally. What does it mean as a Native person? Learning for the first time where your people originally came from, when that knowledge was kind of suppressed at the reservation through assimilation and whatnot. And then I realized that, my Santiam relatives came from the Thomas Creek Band over here by Scio. So this whole area then, between basically Salem and Lebanon, becomes part of my original terrestrial homeland for my people. So, and that's really empowering in some way, knowing exactly where you're from and stuff. And then I want to also talk about accurate history, some of the older history books, and you can get these on Google Books, download them for free as PDFs and stuff. A lot of times they are not quite accurate. A lot of historians didn't go through the effort of checking details, going back into the original records, the primary documents, and checking dates, checking things that happened, or maybe writing that stuff into the history books. So I wanted to fix all that stuff. It isn't that we were removed to the reservation in 1855, but 1856. I mean, these are little details that maybe only nerds like about history, but I wanted to make sure that was more accurate rather than people assuming that we're all moved to the reservation in 1855, which is just not true. And then I wanted to offer an accessible style. I didn't use the heavily stilted, anthropological, sort of like style when I wrote the book. It's not overly referenced, even though there's plenty of references in it. Because I wanted it to be available for everybody, not just people who've gone through anthropology and only can read anthropology stuff. So, and that's available then for high schools, for really the public. And actually, some people told me when they first read it, they got it through in a day or so. So that's kind of nice. It's really hard to sort of get a history book, which can be kind of dry, and it takes a long time to get through it. And that's not fun for anybody. So I want people to actually get information and then be able to go through it pretty quickly. So that works out pretty well. I try and deal with a lot of issues like people come to me over the past and said, well, what happened with those smallpox blankets, or why do people just die off? How come there's so few Native people here? Well, we have the opinion, many of us in the scholarly area, this area, believe that it was malaria that wiped out most of the people. Malaria came here in the valley in about 1830 and wiped out the people. There was no recorded sort of massive war here to wipe out anybody. There were no histories of smallpox blankets here. I've heard some stories perhaps from the Blackfoot area, maybe other stories 4 centuries ago on the East Coast, not in Oregon. So those kind of urban legends just didn't happen here. It really is disease factors, the vector of the mosquitoes and malaria really wiped out something like 99% of some tribes. In this area, on the Columbia, maybe about 75% of the tribes. So that was a really huge factor. And that caused massive changes in political dynamics in the area. Tribes that were decreased by 90-something% couldn't maintain their tribes, so they had to sort of combine the other tribes, sort of consolidate together for survival after that. And so after 1830, it's a vastly different landscape for the politics of the tribes, and it leaves a lot of sort of spaces in the environment for people to come in and settle, which is, settlement in Oregon. And that's part of the story, and I think it's important to understand that. We also know that, and you read this through various signs in literature, the histories of the tribes, that when settlers came here, they vastly changed the land. A lot of farmers, when they came here, saw it as amazing, these clear landscapes, clear flat landscapes where no trees were. They didn't realize the tribes had been setting fires for centuries, perhaps thousands of years, and sort of making landscape. All they saw was this amazingly flat landscape with great soils, really good water, really good sun, and perhaps too much water, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So they began to modify things, and how they modified it, number one, was to plow off everything and to monocrop the whole land. And so now today, much of the valley is monocropped into just a few different crops. All of the native plants are gone, and by the 1850s, it was said that the whole valley was claimed. The tribes were still here, but their food was being plowed under, so they couldn't live anymore. So those environmental changes that were happening to this valley really heavily affected their culture and their ability to survive. So the tribes had to adjust to this new culture, the Western culture that was coming at them, and they had to eventually sell their land and remove, because otherwise they would have been decreased in nothing. And they said this. They said as much in various statements. So Things like fencing really was a problem. You know, settlers didn't want to share their land. It was their property and stuff, so they didn't want people walking across their land. So, I mean, these kind of things really massively changed things. And then settlers also changed water systems. They moved water around. They made mill races. They did, later on we'll talk again, more about water issues. So those are, so I looked at environmental histories really in kind of my newer histories because I'm getting at kind of the end of written records. And so where do we find more evidence of the tribal culture that was here, the Calabrian culture? It's in the land. It's in the original landscape of the land. And what they lived in, the kind of landscape they lived in with the plants and the environment and the water and the fire and all that stuff, that's all part of their culture. So that gives us a big clue, a number of clues as to how they lived. And so we need to investigate that. And I'm having to go back and sort of restore or recover what those landscapes were like in the valley, because now we're 180 years later and most of us don't remember that, right? We weren't alive then. So, yeah, and there was not a lot of environmental histories about the valley, so we just don't know. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So, conditions of the reservation are pretty grim. I'll read this piece. On the Grand Ronde Reservation for some 20 years, tribes were not given land to farm, food, or adequate services like health care. Many people died in the first few years, never seeing the promises fulfilled. Well, when the natives first came to the reservation, they were all relieved of their weapons, and so they could not hunt. Many of them were unfamiliar with this northern territory, did not know where the wild foods grew, like camas berries, or where the good fishing rivers were. The tribes had to instantly change their diets from wild foods they caught, hunted, gathered, or dug to beef, pork, flour, oil, and some vegetables. These were foods the native people had very little experience with. The tribes were completely at the mercy of federal agents and the environment, and the sudden cumulative changes of 1856 contributed to malnutrition and sicknesses. These people who came to the reservation and were moved in the reservation by maybe May 1856 were not healthy. Many of them had come out of a war, those from the south, some from the north. Many of them had lost all their family members through disease. Many of them had been fighting or having conflicts with local settlers, and then all of a sudden they had to go live on a reservation and not leave. They were not allowed to leave, and only eat the foods they were given. So that's a huge change, and we see lots of sicknesses in the first few years, to the point where they built a hospital, a tent hospital at Grand Ronde, had 70-something beds, and yet they said that half the camp was sick in the first year. So it was a pretty grim situation, and I believe a lot of people died unrecorded in the camps around Grand Ronde because there was not enough people there to help them out. Not enough food, there was no medicine. In fact, I read a report the other day about the first doctor visit to Grand Ronde was in, I believe it was February 1856, when the first tribes got there, some Calapooians and Umpqua people got there. He didn't have any supplies. He had just signed the contract for working at the reservation as a doctor, and so he lived just down the road. So he came up and visited, and he started writing a report out. He said, "There's all these people sick. There's all this malnutrition. There's all this stuff," and he prescribed tea and rice. Because he had no supply, he had no medicines at all, and then he wrote a big long list of medicines for the superintendency to buy. So people had no help, and were very, very sick in that first few years. So the reservation was not a place where you could make money. People were supposed to stay there. There were about 6 jobs doing regular labor on the reservation, and most of those jobs were done by local farmers. They would hire white farmers to come in and do the work. They would get paid like $12 a month, and if an Indian person happened to get the job, one of those jobs, he would be paid $6 a month. So you could see a little bit unfair there. And so back then, $6 a month was probably pretty good. Nowadays, probably not. So, so people had to get passes to leave in order to make money. because they were not getting enough supplies or food or the right kind of food at the reservation for a long time. And so they would apply to the Indian agent for a pass, and they had to carry a written pass with them when they left the reservation. They'd go back to their original homelands to maybe hunt or fish or whatever, gather food, and bring it back. And they would generally go back to the original lands. They would go back to places they already knew, because a lot of times they knew the farmers. They would sometimes work for them, and then they knew the area where they could hunt really well and maybe dig camas and do some fishing. So that's what we do. And that went on for 20, 30, 40 years. We have a record of some 20 years of that from a logbook we found at the Oregon Historical Society. But these people were joined kind of the labor force in the valley. They became the indigenous migrant farm laborers of the valley, the first ones. And they were pretty consistent. They would come like every season into the Willamette Valley and set up camp next to the farmer's land and help tend to the crops and then harvest the crops at the end of the summer. This was a pretty consistent thing for Grand Ron in the Salem and Wheatland Ferry and Independence area for things like hops and beans and berries and things like that. But it was pretty consistent. Also, some people would come over here to, as far as Sweet Home, up to Springfield, over to Portland too. We saw tribes coming over the mountain from Warm Springs to work in the valley in this area. So lots of people coming to the valley as well. So it was a pretty consistent thing that happened. And so they would make some money that way and then take whatever money they could from the summer back to the reservation. And in the wintertime, they would have been gathering natural resources like sedges and reeds and stuff like that, and they would be making basketry. And later on, during Prohibition, a lot of the people were making moonshine and ales and stuff, and they were selling that to bars, underground speakeasies in Portland and stuff. So they did whatever they could to survive because they were not given a lot of help by the government. So money could be made really many different ways. It's just a matter of getting busy and doing it. So there's a couple of statements here from chiefs of the tribe that were really kind of outgoing with their statements. They didn't seem to be afraid of saying what they wanted. First one is from a meeting at the Methodist Church. They had all the tribe leaders there, and they were being lectured to by missionaries and people from the Indian Agency, the Indian office, about their habits. They wanted their kids and them to go to white doctors. They wanted them to stop gambling, stop drinking, and sort of living a moral life. That's why they were in the Methodist Church, so being lectured to. So, and the chiefs of the reservation pushed back against Bruno's words, citing that they had been taught to drink by whites, and everyone seemed to be drinking and gambling anyway, so why stop? They wanted equal treatment. They explained how poor everything was on the reservation, that they had no resources, and the promises of land sales and treaty making had not worked. They were still poor while the whites got rich. They revealed that the white Indian agents were not following the laws, and the United States was not appropriately following their agreements in the treaties of giving allotments and funding for the needs of the reservation. So this situation went on for like 20 years. They didn't have, in the treaties, they said they're going to be given some land at the discretion of the president. They were never given any land. They had like a half acre or something. And so they were growing some vegetables and some food, but they couldn't stay there because they weren't growing enough food. So, so finally, once President Ulysses S. Grant got busy and said he would offer a path to citizenship for Native people if they civilized, the Indian office finally started helping them out, giving them the right supplies. And then once they got some land, they started out with about 100 acres apiece. They helped each other out on the reservation to tend that land, and by the 1880s, they were determined. It was reported by the Indian agents at Grand Ron that they were self-sufficient. That means they were doing all of the labor of tending the crops, tending animals, of running 12-horse, plows, of running the mills, the sawmill and grist mill themselves. They were doing all the mechanical work and everything. So, and I think they learned to do that because they learned they could not trust the government to do it for them. So they were doing it all themselves, and so they were not getting a lot of help from the government at that point. And then impoverishment. So in 1872, Chief Louis Neposank and other chiefs of the reservation signed a petition that they sent to President Grant. I have now been on the reservation 16 years. During that time, I have seen poor white men come here as officers of to stay a few years and go away rich, while I and all my people have always been growing poor. We had first had a great deal of money and we came here in agreement with the terms of our treaty. My people have never got much benefit for that money. Our superintendents and agents have got all of it, while I have seen my people die for want of food, just as horses die in the winter when they have nothing to eat. The men you have sent here for officers have not only stolen our money, but have violated our women, scattered diseases among us, which have reduced our numbers from thousands to hundreds. When the tribes first got to the reservation, and there were some 4,000 people moved to Grand Ronde and Siletz. There was about 1,200 people at Grand Ronde. In 1856, 57, by 1900, there was 400 people left. And it wasn't all by disease they died. A lot of people figured out that if they could pass as perhaps white, they could leave the reservation in the middle of the night, escape, and stop identifying as native, and they would get paid twice the wage when they went to Portland or Salem or someplace else. So a lot of people just left because it was a bad place to live. So my project has been sort of rewriting history, writing these histories into our history books. I don't see it as my place to hold on to it for myself. I'm not writing this only for me. I'm writing this for the tribe, first off, and for everybody else that may be concerned about history and that accurate history also. I want to see people learn about this history. I want there to be a higher understanding of Native peoples and our sort of collective organ history for our community, because I don't want to have to teach always about stereotypes every time I teach class. I want to be able to teach more accurate histories, much more deeper histories, and much more advanced situations than just about stereotypes and mascots all the time. But our people, they did survive. The culture did survive in the tribe, and a few families kept it, held on to it. At the same time, they learned to sort of get along in society. A lot of them became pretty well known in Oregon and respected, and so some of those people are my family, some are other families, and I just want everybody to hear those stories. So let me move on to the next part of the presentation. So I call this Reconstructing Traditional Indigenous Environments of the Willamette Valley. First off, this is a place very near here off Peterson Butte. This is kind of the valley today, sort of in the middle of the summer, where much of it is cropland. It's just arid, dry cropland. Farmers like to control the water. They don't like their crops to be drowned out with the Oregon rains. So they create a dry landscape. And much of it is done by ditching and drain tiling in the valley. And I grew up in the Willamette Valley, so I didn't realize this was odd until a few years ago when I began thinking, how come we don't have so much water in the valley? We hear all these stories about all the Oregon rain, but there's hardly any water in the valley at all. It's all dry landscape. What's going on with this? Let's look into this a little bit. So it used to be, before there were all the dams, like the Sanyan dams, this would happen all the time. It doesn't happen hardly anymore, except for in certain small basins like maybe the Lucky Mute. So we don't get the flooding. The water is much more controlled, much more channelized. There's not as much water in the land itself, like sitting in the land as a storage basin. I first began looking into this when I was doing research on Lake Labiche. There's an essay online, you can read it if you want, called Draining Lake Labiche. So I grew up in Salem, about half an hour down the road on a bicycle from the lake, down Porton Road, and the lake in my lifetime, has never been a lake. So I had to go back pretty far back in time to find a picture of the lake, and this is actually an 1852 GLO map, because I can't find any maps, any pictures of the lake at all. It's really hard to find those things. And so we see the lake in the middle here, and then we see all this other swales coming off it, which I colorized to make it stand out. And I started reading about Lake Labiche, and I said, well, they said it was a big lake, and then about 1870s, 1880s, a lot of farmers were really getting upset because they had expanded their farms. So these guys had expanded their farms, and they were upset because in the summer, Oregon was apt to rain any day. So when that happens, these things happen, these swales, this ponding happens, and that drowns out their crops, right? And they're very upset about that. They want to use all of their land for cropland. They don't want to use just 20% or 10% of it. So what they did, it appears that they attracted investors, and we know that these investors were the Hayes brothers from California. They were the inheritors of the San Jose Mercury News fortune, and they bought 1,000 acres of land at Lake Labiche for $1 an acre, because at that time, this land was called wasted land, only worth like $1 an acre. So they spent $150,000 of their own money to dig a ditch to the Willamette River that way. It only took them 2 or 3 years to do it. And once they were done, and once other farmers had built their ditches, like the Jones ditch and a few others, and then began working on things like drain tiling, putting drain tiles on the land, they began draining all this water out that was constantly coming in from the Pudding River out to the Willamette. And so by 1918, it was declared dry enough to have more crops, and it really took another 4 decades to really truly control it. They began working on controls. They put a dam in the 1960s. They finally completely controlled the water. But so this whole land turns into a dry wasteland, this arid wasteland that we have today in the valley as farmland. And those Hayes brothers, they took much of their land and sold it at then a premium price, because they had created very worthful land. And one of them invested in a neighborhood now in Salem called Hayesville, built up Hayesville. The other brother took off with a farmer friend to Gaston at Wapato Lake. And let me look at a few things before there. So we have, this is Lake Labiche today, and we have really dark peat soils here. And we have, mostly it's onions. They mostly grow onions and hazelnuts and blueberries on Barstool Lake. Is there a doctor in the house, maybe?
Yes, please call 911. Is someone calling? Yeah. Yes, they call right now. Excuse me, is there a wheelchair here?
It's taken. I'm sorry.
A desk chair would work with wheels. I think if you just. It's too bad. Just don't fall out of the chair.
Sitting there. Is there a what?
Okay, we're ready.
Linda, you can go ahead now.
Okay, I can. Well, I was excited. Hope he's good. He's fine. All right, so at Lake LaBeche, so they've been growing onions there for a long time. It's pretty well known. Nice black peat soils. And this is probably what the lake should look like, kind of a watery landscape. It happened to be a lot of rain this winter. And I got a good picture out there. And there's actually some ducks out there. So the lake was written about in newspapers as being very full of animals. Thousands of animals lived in it. And so I was contacted by a farmer out there after my article went online. And he said, well, he put his land, 70 acres, into conservation and 20 years ago. So this was coming back, and this is wapato. Wapato is a native plant, a food plant that we would harvest, the Calabrians would harvest. People sort of dig the bulbs and eat it. It was called Indian potato back in the day. So people would, everybody would eat it, and it's actually pretty good. I had some just a couple days ago. It tastes kind of like celery. It's very starchy, but it tastes like celery. It's not non-pleasant at all. So, and this is the wapato. So it looks like this conservationist is actually destroying the drain fields on his property, and the wapato came back by itself. He didn't plant it; it just came back. So we think that there's an opportunity then to restore some landscapes in that lake area, in some area, and so that we can perhaps bring part of it back. But we're working on this piece of land right now. And then so the other Fayes brothers takes his fortune, goes up to a place called Wapato Lake outside of Gaston, Oregon, and did the same thing. Bought hundreds of acres up in this Wapato Lake, and then built or dug a trench all the way to the Willamette River, actually to the 12th River, and then they eventually by 1935 were able to drain off that lake. It's a nice, again, black peat soils, really great soil, really good water coming in the valley. Farmers have spent good long time, decades trying to control the water. Never really got fully control of it, and so now they've kind of given up, and they're working on restoring the lake now through National Park System. But this is probably what something would look like. It was a vast resource. We have a lot more cultural information about the lake than we did about Lake Labiche. We know that the Tualatin Calipuians, they wanted it as a reservation. In fact, in 1851, they drew this line around the lake saying, we want this as a reservation, we want to keep this as a reservation forever. And other stories in newspapers suggested that the lake was a pretty good stopover for ducks. Hundreds of thousands of ducks and geese would go there in the season when they were sort of flying back sort of south and eat wapato and all the other like frogs and everything else there. And so they call them dabblers. It's probably canvasback ducks that were there. And so there were so many ducks there that sportsmen from Portland would come there on the weekend and set up duck blinds around the lake and shoot the ducks in the lake, like every weekend for decades. And it became such a big thing that they just got tired of picking up ducks and stopped picking them up and left them dying in the lake. And the farmers were kind of upset about that. They were like, they smell bad. So, but by 1935, they were able to drain off the whole lake bed, turn this into an agricultural landscape, and that destroyed not just the resource, the cultural resource for the native people, who later on could have used it to recover their culture, but it also destroyed the resource for the ducks and any other animals that used it. So now we don't have hundreds of thousands of ducks coming into that area of the valley, which we used to. So ducks you see much more prominent on the landscape. If you've read anything by naturalists in Oregon, they talk about that stuff. They talk about there being tens of thousands of ducks and geese and birds and stuff everywhere all the time. So that had to be a major sort of resource for the tribes. Again, teaching us a little bit about the tribe by looking at the environment. They would harvest the wapato bulbs, and they would probably be hunting ducks too in the same place. Apparently they're really good tasting too. So I've been doing more research on water systems and different plant life. So I don't know if you know that camas is a major food. You probably have a lot of it around. In fact, I've driven around here during the right season, May, and seen lots of camas in the fields around here. Major food source for the tribes, probably the number one food source for all the tribes in the area. The second one would be probably wapato, and then probably acorns. The third, but I wanted to have more evidence of how watery everything was in the valley. So I started looking again at GLO maps, General Land Office maps, and then I found this one, this wet canvas prairie that was up by Rick Rial, giant prairie area, kind of by Basket Slough today. So that'd be in the Yamhill Lucky Butte area. And then we have these giant sloughly wetlands up in the Tualatin Basin, kind of up by the Coast Range. They're draining off the Coast Range, these giant wetlands up there. And then we have in the Central Valley, we had, I think this is actually Poisson Lake, Fish Lake right here by Mount Angel. We have Lake Labiche again. Then we had a miry swamp or slough up by Woodburn. So this is a culmination of a lot of different GLO maps together. So this becomes a very prominent landscape in the valley. I'm just looking at lakes. I'm not even bringing in wetlands or lesser lakes. And then we go south of Eugene and Springfield, and we have Camas Whale. This huge, nearly covers the whole slide for the GLO map. This huge swale that's still there. If you drive down south on I-5, there's a sign on the highway that says Camas Whale. That's it. So this is the GLO map 352, it's still there. And we have ethnographic evidence from people like Lily and Henry from Springfield. They call it camas whale. Yes, that's because there's lots of camas there. You know, the camas are those little blue flower dumps or pods. So, yeah. So it looks, to me, it looks like wetland environment is a dominant landscape of the valley from north to south, everywhere. It's not just in one place, not just the lakes, it's everywhere. And then we have evidence from even further back, 1841 Wilkes expedition, the U.S. Exploring Corps. They came down through the valley and were walking up the west side of the valley. They got to about the Long Tom, and they found this lake, they call it Lake Lamalee, 80 feet in width and 3/4 mile in length and about a foot deep. Two guys, different journals, same day. So it must have been a huge, like, ponding structure that happened right after a rainfall that they had in the journals. So this is a pretty dominant landscape. It turns out that the ponding action in the valley probably is caused by, and I've been building on this history for the last few months, by how Mount Mazama, when it blew up, it deposited a bunch of soil here in the valley, and that all turned into clay. And so that clay layer that you have in many of your properties that have not been plowed under and stuff creates a water barrier, creates a ponding action. And so what happens is the water sticks around in that pond for a few days and then it slowly drains away. Once it's been all plowed up, it doesn't stick around, it just goes away. And then especially when you put in drain tiling and ditching, it just really drains out fast to the water, which is what farmers want because you want to control the water, right? So my little experiment going to visiting Minto Brown Park outside of Salem. There's a little place called Farm Field, and John Minto was an early farmer, one of the first farmers in Salem. And he had this really nice field up here. Didn't have all of the drain tiling back then because they hadn't invented it yet. But so in 2022, there was some rainfall in May, and this happened. The ponding action happened because he hadn't, he still has clay in the land probably, and there's still, a water barrier there. There was actually enough water to have like big fish in there too. So there's a fish swimming around, almost getting stuck on the edge. And then a couple days later, strike. So native plants do fine. They're like used to it. They are adapted to this environment. Camas does fine. This juncus here does fine. Any kind of native plants are going to do fine because they're used to be in the valley here, being in this sort of partial wetland, partial dry environment. Crops would not do well. They don't do well when they get around. So the U.S. Exploratory Corps also, we were looking at a lot of issues around, cultural burning, perhaps starting fires in the valley to pre-burn areas, prairies, forests, even to control the fuels. And tribes were doing this back in the day, 1841, a few days before they got to Long Tom. They noticed that this whole area had been burnt. They were actually walking through the valley at the time the tribes were burning ahead of them. As you can see the smoke curling above a distant cluster of trees. And it was pretty funny because they would camp on the prairie every night in the middle of these burn spots, and they had horses, and the horses had nothing to eat, so they would take off in the middle of the night, and they'd have to send scouts out for them in the morning, and then the scouts would take a day or two to find these horses, and they were all hanging out in these green patches. He talks about narrow belts bordering the streams where there was still something to eat. That's where they're hanging out. And so because of that, this expedition was not going very quickly down through the valley. They were walking through the valley because the horses were keeping up. But that's another indication of the effect of the fire. And this tells us a lot about how fire reacts if you're doing it on a regular basis, probably every summer, in the valley. It's not destroying everything, it's not burning everything down, it's only burning the prairie and leaving these narrow belts of green by the streams. That's what we do. Again, same thing Dana was talking about too. So this is a conversation I have with people that are proponents of burning a lot. We're working on some test plots in the Smithfield Oaks area outside of Rickreall. Trying to figure out what the smoke and maybe fire does to our white oaks here in Oregon. We don't really know. Most of the tests have been happening in California where they have tan oak and things like that. So we're trying to figure out what that does. Does the smoke help these trees produce a better fruiting, a mast in the next year, or 2 years later? We don't know, maybe. But it clearly would sort of control a lot of the fuel in these prairies. So in our discussion about fire and water, we are now in many areas of the valley actually setting fires, doing a lot of testing. It's looked like it's going to be the answer for the future for saving many of us that are living in forested areas from forest fires, catastrophic fire. But in this valley, we have this unique situation where we have a lot of water too. We still have a lot of water. But through agricultural, because of agricultural needs in the valley, we've kind of destroyed that for most of the valley. We're now draining off all the groundwater to the rivers, where that groundwater should be hanging out maybe a few more days. And that is the normal environment for the native plants in this valley, plants and animals. And so if we're going to bring back fire, I think we need to bring back water too. It can't happen everywhere, but there are some basins that could happen in, perhaps the Lucky Butte, perhaps a few others, that we could perhaps do some restoration work in. The United Nations has said that we're losing wetlands at an extreme rate around the world, and in order to save the animal species of the world and plant species, we need to save 1/3 of our environment for animals and plants. Right now in the valley, we're at 1%. So we're way behind that. So I've redrawn the California man. So he's in water now.
There you go.
It's my little kid drawing. So anyway, so that's my presentation. Thank you. So before I answer a bunch of questions, I will be selling books afterwards for a few minutes. They're $25 a piece. I can't take credit card and cash. Okay, back to you.
So you talked about the white physician not having any supplies.
Yeah.
Probably was a good thing. Medicine wasn't very involved at that time. But what about the native healers? You have foxglove, you have other kinds of plants.
They didn't have the medicines for the European disease. Most diseases were like European or African or something. They didn't have the medicines for that. And they were not shown by doctors and everything how to make quinine for malaria.
Right.
There was one guy who came into the valley who showed them how to do it, but probably too late for it to do any good. So there was quinine for malaria at Fort Vancouver, but that was saved for all the white people.
And that's the other thing that kind of blew me away. I don't think of this area as being a big malaria.
Yeah,
I think more of the south.
Well, we didn't really originally have malaria here. Malaria is a disease, so we do have the mosquito. The mosquito is the Anopheles mosquito. So what we believe is that fur traders who were going through the tropics picked up malaria in their body, and they got onto the Columbia somewhere, like by Fort Vancouver. Our Anopheles mosquitoes picked up on that and carried it around. I think the Southern Valley got it about a year or two later. It took a while for it to move.
Plus the wetlands are
Right,
great
there's
for
really good wetlands. We had lots of mosquitoes back then. We don't have the many mosquitoes today, but I did find records from like the state of Oregon, that they were treating for Anopheles mosquitoes into the 1950s, treating all the wetlands and waterways and so on. So there was a malaria problem. Not as big as the tropics, but it was. Yeah.
The woman mentioned something about you have a blog and a website or something, and I don't know what the address is. Oh, it's on there. Okay.
You already have it. See, there you do know where it is.
Cool.
Okay. Yes.
Can you speak for just a minute about the area where the Calapooya River comes down through Brownsville or in the mountains from Sweet Home to Lebanon, and the people who live there, the native community?
The Tekapa people? Yeah. It was Tekapa Calapooya, right?
Can you spell it?
Tekapa. I think that's it. Yeah.
And what was their primary source of food?
Same as most of the Calapooyas, they're pretty much camas. I don't think there's as much Wapito in the southern valley. We see kind of a line around Salem where the Wapito changes to variety. But we don't see the amount of Wapito as vast as it was in Portland. In Portland, there are lots of it. But also, acorns, hunting. Some of the Calapooyas did fish here. They had fishing weirs and traps and stuff like that. So those are some of the things. We know white-tailed deer, probably the easiest spot because they have white-tails. But that's why I'm not going to do more. But yeah, there's some good stories of them hunting in the area. So.
Do you know if they had a method of controlling the burns?
I think that by burning often, like every year, that is a method of control because you're burning off fuel every year so that there's really nothing for it to burn except for that year's fuel. Plus, I believe they were setting fires at the latter end of the summer, like late August into September when the fall rains began coming in Oregon. It used to be a case that, and I was hearing this when I was a kid, that European vegetables didn't do good here because our rains came too fast. So they needed, I don't know how many days they need for like European vegetables, tomatoes, squash, things like that. But there's a reason why they genetically modified tomatoes and the plants to be better in the Willamette Valley. Things like early girls, things like that, is because we have a very short growing season compared to the places before the rains come. And so, yeah. So I think back to your earlier question, I think that's what we're doing.
Yeah, they probably could anticipate when the rains were coming and they're right before it.
Or right after. And so it appears from the accounts that we had, they're within days of each other. So I think the rain and the swaling may have been something of a control barrier between native plants and the fire. Yeah.
Now, just from what I don't, forest fires, the lightning strike we had, and every year we have that, so they wouldn't have to start a fire. Was it just more not having the suppression?
So we have other studies happening in the forest. It appears that tribes that were using the forest were also setting fires in the forest because they wanted to burn off things like hazel, they wanted to burn off huckleberry plants, and they knew because they'd been watching this happen. They knew that oak trees in the forest would do better about 2 years after you set fire. So what was happening is we believe they were setting burns kind of in some circumference of their trail systems, the mountain trail systems, every year. And it wasn't the same place, it was different places, so you didn't have this almost Venn diagram of a fire setting, so that when there was a lightning strike, there would not be extreme fires that you see today. Because they're creating these, they're really creating fire blocks all over the place, fire barriers.
I just thought maybe it naturally happens.
Well, it could happen naturally too, but there are stories from Warm Springs, from the Calapooians, from the Molalla, from the Klamath people, from the Paiutes, of setting fires in the forest after they had been through like huckleberry fields. Because they knew that 2 years later that those huckleberries would be really good. Are you tired now? Yes.
Are these books being introduced into the educational programs?
Yeah, so in college, since I first released it, actually before it was released, people were asking for chapters and stuff, and so it is being used at Willamette, we are using it at OSU, it is being used at U of O, I've heard they're using it at PCC, I don't know at PSU, but I haven't heard it yet about college using it, but like if high school teachers want to use parts of it, or not the whole thing, we do put together like special chapters for them.
Is that happening?
Yeah, I've had several requests for that. I just taught in a Master of Naturals class for OSU, and they only want 3 chapters, so I can do 3 chapters.
I have another question.
Yeah.
The camas, how is that prepared and what part of it do you eat?
The bowl. So it's prepared by, normally they would have prepared it by cooking it, like baking it underground for about 3 days, 4 days sometimes, letting it sort of turn kind of brownish, and it's kind of sweet at that point. Nowadays, a lot of people use a crock pot or something with a little moisture in there. Cook it for about 2-3 days. There's that pretty good.
And do you know what it tastes like?
It tastes pretty good. I mean, you can boil it like a potato for 20 minutes. But that is a very sort of spongy, oily thing. Probably no.
I'm not going to say anything.
But yeah. Right. It's really sweet. It's has good flavor. In fact, a lot of people would eat it almost like a treat, and then they would sometimes dry it and rehydrate it too in the winter time. In fact, there's stories from the Brownsville Museum about a little girl that, there was a cowboy man that left a gunny sack full of prepared camas in their barn, and he left. And he didn't come back for a couple of years. So in the meantime, this little girl liked it, so she was stealing one every few days. And by the time he got back, it was gone. So it isn't just native people like it.
And just so you know, Tony Forkwall did the talk on the Native Americans here in our area. He talked about camas extensively in his talk, and it's on YouTube. It's on our Lebanon Museum page on YouTube. And he has examples of it. He even shows you what the camas looks like. It was really cool. He talked about cooking it. I didn't even think
No, I like preparing for our kids.
You didn't talk about cattails.
I didn't?
Well, I didn't hear it because I was busy out there. You did.
Do you want to?
Oh, no. Yes.
Do you want to say something about
I'm
it?
really, really embarrassed.
Do you want to say something about it?
No. I should just poke my thunder.
We have harvest cattails too. There are tacos. So yeah, we harvested all kinds of things. The junkus, cattails, tule, cattails we eating in mats and stuff.
Oh, right.
So a lot of things we harvested for basketry, you have to dry for about a year, and then you rehydrate it, and you can use it. Either weave it or you weave through it. Yes?
Did the Calapooias like migrate from winter to summer at different campgrounds?
Yeah, we don't call it migrating. We call it, in anthropology, using this anthropology language, we call it seasonal round. So the way I explain it to my students is it's similar to you going to Costco every couple of weeks. I mean, literally, do you stay at home? No, you go to Costco every couple of weeks and grab some supplies you can last a month, or Diet Coke or whatever, right? So that's what they would do. They would travel to places where there were things ripe, fish are running, deer come out of the woods, something like that. Elk had a big herd. So they would travel these places and have a camp. It's usually some sort of specialized camp, and they would process the food in the field, and then bring back the processed food to their what we call winter village, where they would sometimes dry it, and sometimes heat on the spot. But what they say is that they dried it all the time, and then they would rehydrate it in the wintertime, so drying would preserve good. So, but yeah. So, and those encampments are not dissimilar to you guys going on to your hunting camp in the woods or going fishing for the weekend or whatever.
So then where were their winter camps because it was so wet in the valley?
Right, winter camps were kind of higher. I believe they were on a higher elevation because they knew the valley got wet, they knew there'd be like, sort of like floods in the valley, and so they would set their camps at higher elevation, the winter camp especially, because it was a more permanent, structure, plank house. They would, in the summertime, they would go live down by the river because it's easier to get water and it's fun to use your canoe. So that's, and they would make like more of a brush house in the summer. Because if a flood came along, you're not really losing a lot. So you're losing a brush house. So yeah, so that's kind of what they did. And in fact, in Eugene, I don't know if you heard the story about Eugene Skinner, him going down there in 1846, and the Calipuians told him, "Don't put your house down there on the wetland down there. Put your house up on the butte because it's going to flood occasionally down here." And so that's what he did. He put his house on the butte, which became Skinner's Butte, because the Calipuians suggested he do so. So, and then all the stories from Eugene about the Calipuians suggest they all lived in more of a higher elevation. Yeah.
The council tree, have you heard about it? Do you want to hear about
There are a
it?
number of them.
Well, I know one up there on Liberty Road. Somebody had told me about it years ago. When we went up there, we couldn't find it. Locals didn't even know. It's between Lebanon and Sweet Home, up Liberty Road, I believe.
Yeah, I think I've seen that one. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a lot to it. And I guess I expected something different, but I guess a lot of native tribes.
In every tribal area, there's kind of a council
There's
tree
other, okay.
where tribes come and do like a little power together and stuff. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's still any, like, winter camps that have, that still have any remaining structures that.
That's one thing the archaeologists have not found. They've not found Calipui structures. They found perhaps a few floors, perhaps. They've not found the structure. So, and we don't know why. Maybe it's because they disappeared so fast in the valley in 1830. Yeah. Yes.
Medicinal plants in this area used by the California.
I just don't talk about it much because I don't want people to do their own thing.
Big pharma.
Yeah, there are medicinal plants. People go in the forest and get them. So
Yeah, you grow them.
harvest roots and things like that.
Yeah.
But I don't talk about that in public because I just don't want people to do the wrong thing, harvest too much of them,
Right.
destroy them, use them wrong.
I understand.
Anything else? Yes.
This is out of the area, but do you know anything about the Salilo Falls situation in Columbia Falls?
Besides the fact that it's drowned out.
Yeah, I mean, do you know the history behind it? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to reveal it.
The tribes, fished there for thousands of years, and then the government decided they want to put a power plant there. Sure. Yeah. And they didn't follow through with the promises of building houses for them. Sure. That's been going on for some 70 years now. Yeah. Hopefully, we get some movement on that. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, curious, is the Chemawa Indian School still up in Salem?
It is. It's still open. I don't think they get a ton of students, but it is still open. I wish they would do more with it if they're going to keep it open, because it's actually pretty trashed. I walked around on the grounds, and it's like it looks like some inner city area where you really don't want to go. But yeah, they need to put more money into that and need to really turn into a true school again. Maybe, I don't know, maybe a consortium of tribes can take it over and do something better with it. Yeah, I don't know. Yes?
Yeah, did they trade with other tribes from different areas?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Like what?
Everything. Whatever they could pick up and carry with them, yeah. Canoes, planks, mats, baskets, food, people, slaves, absolutely. Dentalium, whatever they had, so. Whatever was worth some money. Calipuians are pretty well known for harvesting things like wapato and camas, and so they would take it up to Willamette Falls and trade for things they had up there. And so I think they could have, I know there's stories of the Calipuians trading buffalo robes to the Coos. If you guys know anything about buffalo, there aren't that many buffalo in Oregon. Where do you get the buffalo robes? So the question, that's a good question. So it would have to have come through, in my mind, through the Columbia River Trade Network, where the Nez Perce or Shoshone or somebody had gotten buffalo, had traded buffalo robes into the Columbia River, and had somehow got down into the Willamette Valley, and they moved it over to the Coos. So that's a trade network that maybe crosses half a continent. Absolutely. All right, I think I tired you out.